I'm curious if you've kind of butt up against that yourself, or if you have someone on your team that has, and just any advice for someone that maybe struggles to look at a company through the lens of downside or look at a company through the lens of upside.
It's funny, my fiance is a growth investor and their team comes from a credit background. So they're often thinking about the downside protection and sort of doing a lot of structure in their investments. And it's so funny to talk about some of these really early stage risky bets with him because he's one of my favorite members of our imaginary investment committee because he's always going to point out exactly what the risks are. And it's a really good perspective to help poke holes in our thesis and arguments. But for someone like him, and I obviously have many co-investor friends who think a little bit more conservatively that way, they're great thought partners and great sparring partners. But it can be very, very hard to, as you pointed out, really sort of suspend that disbelief and think about or look to the upside case. It's a little bit like that term you mentioned earlier, fear planning, or was it
Fear setting. Yep.
Fear setting, exactly. I think it's an exercise that very conservative and downside focused folks need to do for the upside. Sort of like put it all aside. What if it went right? What if it all worked out? And so it is a bit of an exercise to sort of set everything else aside and just like imagine for a minute what things could look like and then work backwards from there on the analysis.
You just hinted at it, but I love that idea of an imaginary investment committee because it seems like that could also be really helpful. Maybe there's someone who's incredibly optimistic that always has an upside scenario on that committee. Maybe someone like your friend in credit.
Yeah, exactly. So we, the investment committee at Avid, it's myself and my partner Tali, and she comes from Bessemer Venture Partners, and so is extremely well trained in thinking through scenarios and the probabilities. And like me, is very metrics driven, but also has that ability to believe and see what the upside is. We try to always solicit additional opinions and really sort of be intellectually honest with ourselves as we, for every investment, go through the thesis and the risks section of why we're doing the investment, but what the risks are. And it's because of our model, we're often investing with a lead investor. And so we get that sort of effective investment committee by working really closely with co-investors. We also have just really awesome mentors and advisors who were able to sort of run some of these concepts or ideas by. And so much of our work and our diligence is actually leveraging our network, whether it's founders, co-investors who know some of these spaces and industries very deeply. Some of them just tend to be naturally very conservative. Some tend to be very sort of bullish and upside driven. So we make sure we plot their perspectives accordingly, knowing their backgrounds. But I think especially for small firms and small teams, it's so critical to make sure we're not falling into groupthink and that we are sort of really exposing ourselves to any potential blind spots in our thinking.